Virginia, 1847. Welcome to a story that will shatter everything you believe about power, control, and the human spirit. In the tobacco fields of Virginia, where the social order seemed as permanent as the Blue Ridge Mountains themselves, one woman was about to rewrite history with her bare hands. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell. This tale of forbidden power will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about dominance and submission. The morning mist clung to the James River like secrets to a guilty conscience when Anabel first set foot in the Lambert mansion as its new mistress. The year was 1847, and the tobacco plantations of Virginia had never witnessed such an audacious spectacle. "Lord have mercy," whispered Martha, the head cook, as she watched through the kitchen window. "That woman done married Master Lambert, and now she walking through that front door like she owned the place." Anabel moved with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to navigate the world with calculated precision. At 28, she possessed a beauty that was both striking and dangerous. High cheekbones that caught the morning light, eyes the color of rich Virginia soil, and a bearing that suggested she had never truly been broken, despite 20 years in bondage. The mansion itself seemed to hold its breath. Built in 1798 by Lambert's grandfather, the three-story Georgian structure had housed 4 generations of tobacco wealth. Its walls had witnessed countless acts of cruelty, but never anything quite like this. Lambert stood in the grand foyer, his hands trembling slightly as he watched his new wife ascend the mahogany staircase. At 52, he was a shadow of the imposing figure he'd once been. The death of his first wife, Eleanor, 3 years prior had left him hollow, and the recent financial troubles had stripped away much of his former confidence. "Anabel," he called softly, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. Would you like me to show you to your chambers?" She paused on the 7th step, her hand resting on the polished banister. When she turned to look at him, there was something in her gaze that made him feel exposed, vulnerable in a way he'd never experienced. "Our chambers, Lambert," she corrected, her voice carrying the refined accent she'd cultivated during her years as Eleanor's personal attendant. "We are married now, are we not?" The words hung in the air like smoke from the tobacco barns. In the kitchen, Martha dropped a pewter spoon, the clatter echoing through the servant corridors like a gunshot. Lambert's face flushed crimson. "Of course, I simply thought." "You thought what?" Anabel descended 2 steps, closing the distance between them. "That I would be content to remain in the quarters, that this marriage was merely a legal formality." The transformation had begun the moment Judge Harrison pronounced them husband and wife in the courthouse that morning. The ceremony itself had been a scandal that would be whispered about in Richmond drawing rooms for decades to come. Half the county's elite had attended, not out of support, but out of morbid curiosity. Mrs. Pemberton, the banker's wife, had fainted when Lambert placed the gold band on Anabel's finger. Colonel Whitmore had stormed out, declaring it an abomination against God and nature. But Anabel had stood there, radiant in a dress of deep blue silk that had once belonged to Eleanor, and accepted each shocked gasp as if it were applause. Now, in the privacy of their home, the real performance was about to begin. "I have spent 20 years learning the ways of this house," Anabel continued, her voice never rising above a conversational tone, yet somehow filling every corner of the foyer. "I know which floorboards creak, which servants can be trusted, and which debts keep you awake at night." Lambert's breath caught. "Anabel, please." "Please what?" She moved closer, and he caught the scent of the lavender soap Eleanor used to favor. "Please remember my place. Please be grateful for the scraps of dignity you've thrown my way." The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the Persian rugs. In those shadows, the ghosts of the past seemed to dance. Eleanor's gentle laughter, the cries of children sold away from their mothers, the crack of overseers' whips in the distant fields. "You freed me, Lambert," Anabel said, her hand now resting on his chest, feeling his rapid heartbeat through the fine cotton of his shirt. "But freedom is not something that can be given. It must be taken." That evening, as the household settled into an uneasy quiet, Anabel made her first move. She appeared in the dining room wearing one of Eleanor's evening gowns, altered to fit her fuller figure. The emerald silk brought out the gold flecks in her dark eyes, and the low neckline suggested a confidence that made Lambert's hands shake as he reached for his wineglass. "Tell me about the Thornfield debt," she said without preamble, cutting into the roasted duck that Martha had prepared with trembling hands. Lambert nearly choked on his wine. "How do you—" "That's not something that concerns you. Everything that concerns this household concerns me now." She set down her fork and fixed him with a stare that seemed to see straight through him. "I know about the mortgage payments you've missed. I know about the creditors who come calling when you think the servants aren't listening. I know about the nights you sit in your study, staring at those ledgers until dawn." The candles flickered in their silver holders, casting dancing shadows on the oil portraits of Lambert ancestors that lined the walls. Those painted eyes seemed to judge the scene unfolding below them, the master of the house being dissected by a woman who just that morning had been his property. "How?" Lambert whispered. Anabel smiled, and there was something almost predatory in the expression. "Did you think I spent all those years in Eleanor's shadow without learning anything? I read every letter, every document that passed through this house. I listened to every conversation you thought was private. Knowledge, Lambert, is the only currency that truly matters." She rose from her chair and moved around the table with the fluid grace of a cat stalking its prey. Lambert remained frozen as she approached, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "You're afraid," she observed, her voice soft but penetrating. "Not of me exactly, but of what I represent. The end of everything you thought you understood about power." Her hand touched his shoulder, and he flinched as if burned. "Anabel, I don't understand what you want from me." "Want?" She laughed, a sound like silver bells with an edge of steel. "I want what every person wants, Lambert. I want to never be powerless again." The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 9 times, its deep notes reverberating through the mansion like a funeral dirge. Somewhere in the servant quarters, hushed voices discussed the day's unprecedented events. The field hands, returning from their labor, spoke in whispers about the woman who had somehow climbed from the bottom of their world to its very top. "Tomorrow," Anabel said, her hand still resting on Lambert's shoulder, "you will take me to Richmond. I want to meet your banker, your creditors, your business associates. I want them to see that things have changed at the Lambert plantation." "Anabel, that's impossible. Society would never." "Oh, society," she interrupted, her grip tightening slightly, "will adapt. They always do. The question is whether you will adapt with it or be left behind." Lambert looked up at her, and in that moment, something fundamental shifted between them. The man who had once held absolute power over her life now found himself completely at her mercy, and the strangest part was that he didn't want to escape. "What have you done to me?" he whispered. Anabel leaned down, her lips close to his ear. "I've shown you the truth, Lambert. You were never really in control. You just thought you were." As the candles burned lower and the Virginia night settled around the mansion like a dark embrace, the first chapter of their new life together came to a close. But in the shadows of the great house, change was stirring like wind before a storm. The servants felt it. The neighbors would soon sense it. And Lambert, sitting alone in his study long after Anabel had retired to their chambers, knew with absolute certainty that his life would never be the same. The audacious slave had become the master, and the master had discovered that surrender could be its own form of power. 3 weeks after the wedding, the transformation of the Lambert household had begun in earnest. Though few outside its walls yet understood the magnitude of what was occurring, Anabel stood in the morning room, reviewing the household accounts with a precision that would have impressed the most meticulous Richmond banker. The ledgers, once Lambert's private domain, now lay open before her like conquered territory. "Martha," she called, her voice carrying the authority of someone born to command. "Please ask Mr. Lambert to join me here." The cook appeared in the doorway, her weathered face a mask of confusion and barely concealed awe. In all her 30 years of service to the Lambert family, she had never seen such a reversal of fortune. "Yes, ma'am," Martha replied, the title coming naturally despite the circumstances. There was something about Anabel that demanded respect, something that transcended the artificial boundaries of race and former status. When Lambert entered the room, Anabel noticed immediately how his posture had changed. The proud bearing of a Virginia gentleman had given way to something more tentative, more deferential. He moved like a man walking on uncertain ground. "You wanted to see me?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of anxiety that hadn't been there a month ago. "Sit," Anabel commanded softly, gesturing to the chair across from her. It was the same tone she might have used with a well-trained dog, gentle but absolutely firm. Lambert sat without question, and Anabel felt a thrill of satisfaction at his immediate compliance. Each small act of submission was another brick in the foundation of her new authority. "I've been reviewing our financial situation," she began, her finger tracing down a column of figures. "The Thornfield debt is more serious than you led me to believe." "Anabel, please, these matters are complicated. Are they?" She looked up from the ledger, her dark eyes holding his gaze until he looked away. "It seems quite simple to me. You borrowed against next year's tobacco crop to pay this year's expenses. When the crop failed due to that late frost, you found yourself unable to meet your obligations." Lambert's face flushed with embarrassment. "How could you possibly understand the complexities of plantation finance?" Anabel set down her pen with deliberate precision. "Stand up, Lambert." "What?" "Stand up." Her voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the silk. Lambert rose slowly, confusion written across his features. Anabel stood as well, moving around the desk until she was directly in front of him. Even though he was taller, something about her presence made him feel diminished. "For 20 years, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I watched you make decisions. I listened to your conversations with overseers, with creditors, with other planters. I learned your business because my survival depended on understanding the forces that controlled my life." She reached out and straightened his cravat, the intimate gesture somehow more unsettling than any harsh word. "You think I don't understand complexity? I understood that my value as a human being was tied to the price of tobacco. I understood that my children, if I had been allowed to have them, would have been sold to pay your debts. I understood complexity, Lambert. I lived it." Lambert's breathing had become shallow, and Anabel could see the pulse beating rapidly in his throat. I didn't mean to suggest." "Didn't you?" Her hands moved to his shoulders, and she could feel the tension in his muscles. "You still see me as that frightened girl who used to press your shirts and arrange Eleanor's hair, but that girl is gone, Lambert. She died the day you put this ring on my finger." The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air between them. Outside, the sounds of plantation life continued, the distant voices of field hands, the creak of wagon wheels, the lowing of cattle. But inside this room, a different kind of revolution was taking place. "I want you to go to Richmond today," Anabel continued, her hands still resting on his shoulders. "You will meet with Mr. Thornfield and renegotiate the terms of our debt. Anabel, he'll never agree to—" "He will." Her grip tightened slightly. "Because you're going to offer him something he wants more than money." Lambert's eyes widened. "What could we possibly offer that?" "Information." Anabel smiled, and Lambert felt a chill run down his spine. "I know about his wife's indiscretions. I know about his son's gambling debts in Charleston. I know about the slave woman he keeps in that house on Broad Street. How could you possibly know?" "Servants talk, Lambert. We always have. The difference is that now I'm in a position to act on what I hear." She released him and moved back to her chair, settling into it with the grace of a queen taking her throne. "You will go to Richmond, and you will make Mr. Thornfield understand that it would be in his best interest to be flexible regarding our arrangement." Lambert stared at her, a mixture of fear and fascination playing across his features. "You're asking me to blackmail him?" "I'm asking you to use the tools available to us." Anabel picked up her pen and returned her attention to the ledgers. "Unless, of course, you prefer to lose the plantation entirely." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Lambert knew she was right. They were only months away from foreclosure, and traditional methods of negotiation had failed. But the idea of using such tactics, of descending to what he considered beneath his station— "I can't," he whispered. Anabel looked up slowly, her expression unreadable. "Can't? Or won't?" It's not. It's not how gentlemen conduct business." The silence that followed was deafening. When Anabel finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost gentle, but Lambert felt each word like a physical blow. "Gentlemen," she repeated, rising from her chair once more. "Tell me, Lambert, was it gentlemanly when you sold Sarah's baby to pay for Eleanor's new carriage? Was it gentlemanly when you had Thomas whipped for looking at you the wrong way? Was it gentlemanly when you came to my cabin that night after Eleanor's funeral, drunk and grieving, and looking for comfort you had no right to take?" Lambert's face went white. "We never." "No," Anabel agreed, moving closer with each word. "We never, because I stopped you, because even in my powerlessness I found a way to say no. But you tried, didn't you, Lambert? You tried to take what you wanted, just like you always had." She was close enough now that he could smell the lavender in her hair, could see the gold flecks in her dark eyes. "The difference between then and now is that I no longer have to stop you from taking what you want. Now I decide what you get." Lambert's legs felt weak, and he reached out to steady himself against the desk. "Anabel, please." "Please what?" She tilted her head, studying him like a fascinating specimen. "Please go back to the way things were. Please pretend that you're still the master and I'm still the slave. Please ignore the fact that you need me more than I need you." The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. Without her knowledge of the household, her understanding of their financial situation, her connections among the servant network that stretched across 3 counties, he was lost. She had become indispensable, and they both knew it. "I'll go to Richmond," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "Good." Anabel returned to her chair, her manner becoming businesslike once more. "Take the carriage, not the wagon. Dress well. Remember that you're representing our interests now, not just your own." As Lambert turned to leave, she called after him, "Lambert." He paused in the doorway, not turning around. "When you return this evening, I want you to come directly to me. Not to your study, not to the library, to me. We'll discuss how the meeting went, and then we'll plan our next steps." "Yes," he whispered. "Yes." "What?" Lambert's shoulders sagged in defeat. "Yes, Anabel." After he left, Anabel sat alone in the morning room, the ledgers spread before her like maps of a conquered territory. Through the window she could see the tobacco fields stretching toward the horizon, the same fields where she had once labored under the burning Virginia sun. Martha appeared in the doorway, carrying a tea service on a silver tray. "Will you be taking your tea here, ma'am?" "Yes, thank you, Martha." Anabel gestured to the small table by the window. "And Martha, I'd like you to gather the house servants this afternoon. It's time we discussed some changes to how things will be run." Martha's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "Will Mr. Lambert be joining us?" Anabel smiled, and there was something almost predatory in the expression. "Mr. Lambert will be in Richmond on business. This will be a conversation between us." As Martha left to prepare for the meeting, Anabel turned her attention back to the ledgers. Each column of figures told a story of power and dependency, of debts and obligations that bound people together in ways both visible and invisible. She had spent 20 years learning to read between the lines of such stories. Now, finally, she was in a position to write her own. The afternoon meeting with the house servants was unlike anything the Lambert mansion had ever witnessed. Anabel sat in Eleanor's former chair in the main parlor, while Martha, James the butler, Sarah the laundry woman, and young Peter the stable boy arranged themselves in a semicircle before her. "I want to be clear about something," Anabel began, her voice carrying easily through the high-ceilinged room. "The fact that I am now mistress of this house does not mean that I have forgotten where I came from. I know each of your stories because they were my story too." Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Ma'am, we don't rightly know how to treat me," Anabel finished. "That's understandable. The situation is unprecedented. But I want you to know that while things will change in this house, they will change for the better." She rose and moved to the window, looking out at the fields where other servants were still laboring in the afternoon heat. I cannot free you all, not yet. The legal complications would be overwhelming, and frankly, we cannot afford the financial loss. But I can ensure that your lives here become more bearable." James, who had served the Lambert family for 40 years, cleared his throat nervously. "What kind of changes, Ma'am?" "Better food, better quarters, no more arbitrary punishments, and most importantly, no more separations of families." Anabel turned back to face them, and they could see the steel in her gaze. "I know that some of you have children or spouses on other plantations. We will work to bring them here, or to arrange for regular visits." The silence that followed was profound. These were promises that no white mistress had ever made, concessions that challenged the very foundation of the plantation system. "In return," Anabel continued, "I need your absolute loyalty, not to the Lambert name, not to the plantation, but to me personally. There will be times when I ask you to do things that may seem strange, times when you may not understand my methods, but I need to know that you trust me." Martha was the first to speak. "We trust you, Miss Anabel. We always have." "Good." Anabel smiled, and for the first time since the wedding, it was a genuine expression of warmth. "Because what we're building here is more than just a household. We're creating something new, something that has never existed before, and we're going to do it together." As the servants filed out, each carrying with them a sense of possibility they had never dared to imagine, Anabel remained by the window. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of the tobacco leaves in autumn. Lambert would return soon, and she would learn whether her first test of his obedience had been successful. But regardless of the outcome, she knew that the foundation of her new life was already being laid. The audacious slave was becoming something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. She was becoming a woman who understood that true power came not from force, but from the willing surrender of those who chose to follow her. And Lambert, whether he realized it or not, had already made his choice. The carriage wheels crunched on the gravel drive as Lambert returned from Richmond, just as the last light of day faded behind the Blue Ridge Mountains. Anabel watched from the upstairs window of their bedroom, noting the slump of his shoulders, the way he seemed to hesitate before stepping down from the carriage. She had spent the afternoon preparing for this moment, choosing her dress with the same care a general might select his weapons. The deep burgundy silk had been Eleanor's favorite for entertaining, but on Anabel's figure it suggested something far more commanding than mere social grace. When Lambert entered their bedroom 20 minutes later, he found her seated at Eleanor's vanity, brushing her long dark hair with slow, deliberate strokes. The mirror reflected her face, and Lambert could see that she was watching him even as she appeared focused on her grooming. "How did your meeting with Mr. Thornfield proceed?" she asked without turning around. Lambert loosened his cravat with trembling fingers. "It was successful. He's agreed to extend the payment terms for another 6 months. And the interest rate, reduced by half." Anabel set down the brush and turned to face him. "Excellent. I assume he was quite reasonable once you explained our position." Lambert's face flushed crimson. "Anabel, what you asked me to do, it wasn't right. Threatening a man with his private affairs wasn't right." Anabel rose from the vanity stool, her movement fluid and predatory. "Tell me, Lambert, what part wasn't right?" "The part where we secured our financial future. The part where we prevented the foreclosure of this plantation. Or the part where you finally learned to use the same tactics that have been used against people like me for centuries." She moved closer, and Lambert found himself backing toward the wall. "You think there's honor in poverty, nobility in losing everything because you're too proud to fight with the weapons available to you. It's not how gentlemen—" "Gentlemen," Anabel's voice cracked like a whip. "You keep using that word as if it means something. As if there's some sacred code that makes your suffering more noble than mine." Lambert's back hit the wall, and he realized with a start that he was trapped. Not physically. He could easily push past her if he chose. But psychologically, something about her presence, her absolute certainty, made resistance feel impossible. "Let me tell you about gentlemen, Lambert," Anabel continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than a shout. "Gentlemen bought and sold my mother. Gentlemen separated me from my sister when I was 12 years old. Gentlemen created a system where human beings could be treated as livestock, and then they called it civilization. Her hand reached out and touched his chest, feeling his rapid heartbeat through the fine cotton of his shirt. And now you want to cling to their rules? Their sense of honor? Even when it means destroying everything we've built? Lambert's breathing had become shallow, and he could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air. "I don't understand what's happening to me," he whispered. "Don't you?" Anabel's hand moved up to his throat, her fingers tracing the line of his pulse. "You're learning what it feels like to surrender control, to trust someone else to make the decisions that matter, to stop carrying the weight of responsibility for everything and everyone." Her touch was gentle, almost tender, but Lambert felt as if he were drowning in it. This isn't natural. A wife shouldn't. Shouldn't what? Shouldn't be stronger than her husband? Shouldn't understand business better than he does? Shouldn't take charge when he's proven incapable of handling the situation himself? Lambert tried to speak, but no words came. The truth of her statements was undeniable, and the relief he felt at having someone else take control was both terrifying and intoxicating. "Look at me, Lambert," Anabel commanded softly. He raised his eyes to meet hers, and what he saw there took his breath away. There was no cruelty in her gaze, no desire to humiliate or punish. Instead, there was something that looked almost like compassion, mixed with an absolute certainty of her own power. "You've been carrying this burden alone for 3 years," she said, her voice gentle now. "Ever since Eleanor died, you've been trying to hold everything together, and you've been failing. The debts, the plantation, the servants, it's all been too much for you." Lambert felt tears prick at his eyes. "I've tried on me. I know you have. But trying isn't enough anymore. You need help, and I'm offering it. But not as your equal, Lambert. Not as your partner. As your superior." The words should have been insulting, should have triggered his masculine pride and sent him storming from the room. Instead, Lambert felt something inside him crack open, like a dam that had been holding back a flood. "I can't," he whispered. "Can't what?" "Can't let you. I'm supposed to be the man, the head of the household. It's not right for me to—" "To what?" Anabel's hand moved to cup his face, her thumb brushing away a tear he hadn't realized had fallen. "To admit that you need me. To acknowledge that I'm better suited to lead than you are. To stop pretending that your pride is more important than our survival." Lambert closed his eyes, leaning into her touch despite himself. "What do you want from me?" "I want your submission, Lambert. Complete and absolute. I want you to stop fighting me and start trusting me. I want you to kneel." The word hung in the air between them like a challenge. Lambert's eyes flew open and he stared at her in shock. "Kneel? Kneel?" Anabel's voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as if she were asking him to pass the salt at dinner. "Show me that you understand who's really in charge here." Lambert's mind reeled. The very idea was preposterous, unthinkable. A Virginia gentleman did not kneel before anyone, least of all a woman who had once been his property. But even as his rational mind rejected the notion, his body was already responding. His knees felt weak, his breathing shallow. The weight of responsibility, of constant failure, of trying to maintain a facade of control when everything was falling apart, it was crushing him. "I can't," he whispered again, but his voice lacked conviction. "You can," Anabel replied, her hand still cradling his face. "You can let go, Lambert. You can stop pretending to be something you're not. You can give me the control you've already lost." Lambert's legs began to tremble. The rational part of his mind screamed in protest, but it was being drowned out by something deeper, something that craved the relief of surrender. "What will you do?" he asked, his voice barely audible. If I do what you're asking?" "I'll take care of everything," Anabel promised. "The plantation, the debts, the servants, the social obligations, all of it. You won't have to make another difficult decision. You won't have to carry the weight of failure anymore. You'll be free." The word free hit Lambert like a physical blow. Freedom, the very thing he had denied to others for so long, was being offered to him by the woman he had once owned. Slowly, as if in a dream, Lambert's knees began to bend. Anabel stepped back slightly, giving him space, her dark eyes never leaving his face. The descent seemed to take forever, each inch a surrender of everything he had been taught to believe about himself, about his place in the world. When his knees finally touched the Persian rug, Lambert felt something break inside him, not painfully, but like the snapping of chains he hadn't realized he was wearing. The relief was overwhelming, and he found himself gasping for breath as if he had been holding it for years. Anabel looked down at him, and her expression was one of triumph mixed with something that might have been tenderness. "There," she said softly. "Doesn't that feel better?" Lambert couldn't speak. He could only kneel there, staring up at the woman who had somehow become his salvation and his master in the same moment. "From now on," Anabel continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone issuing instructions, "you will come to me before making any decisions regarding the plantation. You will not speak to creditors, neighbors, or business associates without my approval. You will present yourself to me each morning and evening for instructions." Lambert nodded, the movement feeling natural despite its implications. "And Lambert," Anabel reached down and tilted his chin up, forcing him to meet her gaze, "you will never again question my methods or my authority. Do you understand?" "Yes," he whispered. "Yes, what?" Lambert's throat felt dry, but he forced the words out. "Yes, Anabel." She smiled then, and it was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. "Good. Now stand up and prepare for bed. Tomorrow, we have work to do." As Lambert rose on unsteady legs, he caught sight of himself in the vanity mirror. The man looking back at him was someone he barely recognized, humbled, surrendered, but somehow more at peace than he had been in years. Outside, the Virginia night settled over the plantation like a blanket. In the servant quarters, whispered conversations carried news of the strange changes taking place in the big house. Some spoke of it with fear, others with a hope they dared not voice. But in the master bedroom of the Lambert mansion, a new order had been established. The audacious slave had completed her conquest, and the master had learned that sometimes the greatest freedom came through surrender. As Anabel prepared for bed, she reflected on how far she had come from that frightened girl who had once pressed shirts and arranged hair. She had not simply gained her freedom, she had redefined what freedom meant. And tomorrow she would begin the work of reshaping not just the plantation, but the very foundations of power in Richmond County. The revolution had begun, and it would be led by a woman who understood that true dominance came not from force, but from the willing submission of those who chose to follow. 6 months had passed since that pivotal evening when Lambert first knelt before his wife, and the transformation of the Lambert plantation had become the subject of whispered conversations throughout Richmond County and beyond. Anabel stood on the front portico of the mansion, watching as a carriage bearing the seal of Governor William Smith approached down the tree-lined drive. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk, her hair arranged in an elaborate style that would have been the envy of any Richmond society lady. But it was her bearing more than her attire that commanded attention, the absolute confidence of a woman who had never doubted her right to stand exactly where she was. Behind her, Lambert waited in the shadows of the doorway, his posture deferential, his eyes fixed on his wife, with an expression that mixed devotion with something that could only be described as worship. "Governor Smith has arrived," he announced quietly, though Anabel had already seen the carriage. "I can see that, Lambert," she replied without turning around. "Please ensure that Martha has prepared the blue parlor appropriately. The governor will want tea, not coffee, and use the Wedgwood service, not the everyday china." "Of course, Anabel." Lambert hurried away to relay the instructions, moving with the eager efficiency of a well-trained servant. The transformation in him had been remarkable to witness. The broken, debt-ridden planter, who had married her out of desperation, had evolved into something entirely new. A man who found purpose and peace in surrender, who had discovered that his greatest strength lay in acknowledging her superiority. Governor Smith emerged from his carriage with the careful dignity of a politician who understood that this visit would be discussed in drawing rooms across Virginia for months to come. At 62, he was a veteran of the state's political wars, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the situation at the Lambert plantation. "Mrs. Lambert," he said, removing his hat as he approached the portico, Thank you for agreeing to see me. Governor Smith, Anabel replied, inclining her head with exactly the degree of respect due to his office, no more, no less. Welcome to our home. I trust your journey from Richmond was pleasant. Indeed it was. Smith's eyes took in every detail of her appearance, her manner, the way she commanded the space around her. Though I confess the stories I've heard about the changes here made me curious to see them for myself. Anabel smiled, and there was something almost predatory in the expression. Stories have a way of growing in the telling, Governor. Perhaps you'd care to judge the reality for yourself. Lambert will join us for tea. They settled in the blue parlour, a room that had once been Eleanor's domain but now bore subtle signs of Anabel's influence. The furniture arrangement had been altered to create a more commanding position for the hostess, and the portraits of Lambert ancestors had been supplemented with books, maps, and other indicators of serious intellectual engagement. Lambert entered carrying the tea service himself, a sight that made Governor Smith's eyebrows rise slightly. In Virginia society, such tasks were performed by servants, not by the master of the house. "Thank you, Lambert," Anabel said, as he set the tray down with careful precision. "Please pour for our guest." Lambert complied without question, his movements graceful and practiced. When he handed the governor his cup, Smith noticed that the man's hands were steady, his manner calm. Whatever was happening in this household, it wasn't causing Lambert distress. "Governor," Anabel began once they were all seated, "I assume this visit concerns the rumors that have been circulating about our domestic arrangements." Smith nearly choked on his tea. He had expected to dance around the subject for at least an hour before addressing it directly. "Mrs. Lambert, that is to say, there have been certain concerns raised by prominent members of the community." "Concerns about what, specifically?" Anabel's voice remained perfectly pleasant, but there was steel beneath the silk. "About the fact that our plantation is now profitable, about the fact that we've paid off our debts ahead of schedule, about the fact that our servants are well fed and our fields productive, about the unusual nature of your marriage," Smith said carefully, "about reports that the traditional order of things has been altered." Lambert set down his teacup with a slight tremor, but Anabel's expression didn't change. "Traditional order? Governor, are you referring to the tradition that allowed my husband to own me as property until 6 months ago? Or perhaps the tradition that would have seen me sold to pay his debts if circumstances had been different?" The directness of her response left Smith momentarily speechless. In his world, such matters were discussed in euphemisms and careful circumlocutions, not with the brutal honesty Anabel employed. "Mrs. Lambert," he began again, "surely you understand that society has certain expectations." "Society's expectations," Anabel interrupted, "are what created the situation that brought us to this point. Society expected Lambert to manage his affairs competently, and he failed. Society expected me to remain silent and grateful for whatever scraps of dignity I was thrown, and I refused." She rose from her chair and moved to the window, her silhouette framed against the afternoon light. "Tell me, Governor, what exactly are you here to accomplish? Are you planning to dissolve our marriage, arrest me for the crime of being more capable than my husband, force us to conform to standards that have already proven inadequate?" Smith glanced at Lambert, expecting to see some sign of resentment or embarrassment at his wife's words. Instead, he saw something that shocked him to his core. Lambert was looking at Anabel with undisguised admiration, as if her defiance of the governor was exactly what he had hoped to see. "The concerns," Smith said slowly, "center around reports that you have, assumed certain responsibilities traditionally held by the male head of household." "I have assumed the responsibilities that needed to be assumed," Anabel replied, turning back to face him. "Lambert was drowning in debt and poor decisions. I threw him a lifeline. The fact that this required me to take charge of our affairs seems less important than the fact that it worked. But the reports suggest that your husband has become subordinate to you in ways that are unprecedented." Lambert spoke for the first time since serving the tea. "Governor, may I ask you a question?" Smith nodded, curious to hear what the man would say. "Do you believe that a person should be judged by their results or by their adherence to convention?" Well, results are certainly important, but then judge us by our results," Lambert continued, his voice growing stronger. 6 months ago, this plantation was on the verge of bankruptcy. Our servants were underfed, our fields were poorly managed, and I was drinking myself into an early grave. Today we are profitable, our people are cared for, and I am healthier and happier than I have been in years. He looked at Anabel with an expression of pure devotion. If that required me to acknowledge that my wife is better suited to leadership than I am, then I consider it a small price to pay for salvation. Governor Smith stared at Lambert as if seeing him for the first time. You're saying that you willingly, that you chose to. I chose to surrender control to someone more capable of wielding it, Lambert said simply. And in doing so, I found a freedom I never knew existed. Anabel returned to her chair, her movements fluid and confident. Governor, I understand that our arrangement challenges certain assumptions about the natural order of things, but I would suggest that the natural order is whatever works best for the people involved. She leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes holding Smith's gaze. You're a politician, Governor. You understand power, how it's gained, how it's maintained, how it's transferred. What you're witnessing here is simply a more honest acknowledgement of where power actually resides. And where is that, Mrs. Lambert? Anabel smiled, and Smith felt a chill run down his spine. Power resides with whoever is willing to take responsibility for the consequences of wielding it. Lambert tried to carry that burden alone, and failed. I was willing to take it from him, and I have succeeded. The silence that followed was profound. Outside, the sounds of plantation life continued, the distant voices of field hands, the lowing of cattle, the creak of wagon wheels. But inside the blue parlor, 3 people sat in the presence of something unprecedented in Virginia society. What do you want from me? Smith asked finally. Nothing, Anabel replied. I want nothing from you, Governor, except to be left alone to continue building what we've started here. We pay our taxes, we obey the law, we contribute to the prosperity of the county. What happens within the walls of our home is our business. Smith set down his teacup and studied both of them carefully. And if I were to report back to Richmond that the Lambert plantation has become a model of efficiency and prosperity under your management, then you would be telling the truth, Anabel said. And the truth, Governor, has a way of spreading regardless of whether people want to hear it. As Governor Smith prepared to leave an hour later, he found himself profoundly unsettled by what he had witnessed. The woman who had once been property had become the most formidable person he had encountered in years of politics, and her husband's willing submission to her authority challenged everything he thought he understood about marriage, power, and the natural order of society. Mrs. Lambert, he said as they stood on the portico, I suspect that what you've created here will not remain a secret for long. I'm counting on it, Anabel replied. Change, Governor, begins with a single example. Others will see what we've accomplished and begin to question their own assumptions about what's possible. As the governor's carriage disappeared down the drive, Lambert joined his wife on the portico. Do you think he'll cause trouble for us? Anabel considered the question carefully. He might try, but he's also a practical man, and practical men eventually recognize success when they see it. Besides, she added with a smile that held more than a hint of danger, I know things about Governor Smith's business dealings that would make Mr. Thornfield's indiscretions seem like Sunday school gossip. Lambert laughed, a sound of pure delight. You're magnificent, he said, and there was no irony in his voice, only genuine admiration. I'm necessary, Anabel corrected, but thank you for the compliment. That evening, as they prepared for bed, Lambert performed the ritual that had become central to their relationship. He knelt before his wife, not in humiliation but in acknowledgement of the power dynamic that had saved them both. What are your instructions for tomorrow? He asked, his voice calm and expectant. Anabel looked down at him, this man who had once owned her and now belonged to her, in ways that transcended any legal document. Tomorrow we begin planning the expansion of our operations. I want to purchase the Morrison property when it comes up for auction next month. The Morrison property? Lambert's eyes widened. Anabel, that would make us one of the largest landowners in the county. Exactly. She reached down and touched his face gently. We're not just rebuilding the Lambert plantation, my dear husband. We're creating an empire. And empires, by their very nature, change the world around them. As Lambert rose and prepared for bed, Anabel stood at the window looking out over the fields that now belonged to her in every way that mattered. In the distance, she could see the lights of other plantations, other great houses, where the old order still held sway. But change was coming. She could feel it in the air like the approach of a storm. The audacious slave who had married her master and made him kneel was becoming something far more significant. She was becoming a symbol of what was possible when power was claimed rather than granted. The servants spoke of her in whispers that carried across county lines. Other enslaved people heard the stories and began to dream of their own liberation. And in the great houses of Virginia, wives who had never questioned their subordination began to wonder what they might accomplish if they dared to demand more. Anabel Lambert, for she had claimed the name as completely as she had claimed everything else, had become the first dominatrix in Virginia history. But more than that, she had become proof that the foundations of society were far less solid than anyone had imagined. The revolution she had started in a single bedroom was spreading, one whispered conversation at a time, and at its center stood a woman who had learned that the greatest power came not from force, but from the willing surrender of those who recognized true strength when they encountered it. As the Virginia night settled over the plantation, Anabel smiled to herself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to expand her influence and reshape the world around her. But tonight, she was content to savor her victory, the complete and total transformation of a system that had once sought to destroy her into an instrument of her own will. The audacious slave had become the master, and the master had discovered that surrender could be its own form of power. In the process, they had created something entirely new, a relationship based not on tradition or law, but on the honest acknowledgement of who was truly fit to lead. And in the years to come, that acknowledgement would echo far beyond the borders of a single Virginia plantation, challenging assumptions and changing lives in ways that neither of them could yet imagine. The legend of Anabel Lambert had begun, and legends, once born, have a way of reshaping the world in their image. Richmond County, Virginia, 1852, 5 years later. The Lambert plantation had become the most prosperous in 3 counties, its success a testament to what could be accomplished when power was wielded by those truly capable of handling it. Anabel Lambert stood in her study, the room that had once been Lambert's private domain, reviewing correspondence from as far away as Charleston and New Orleans. Letters arrived weekly from women who had heard whispers of the Virginia plantation, where the natural order had been quietly revolutionized. Some sought advice, others simply wanted confirmation that such a thing was possible. Anabel answered them all carefully, knowing that each response was another seed planted in soil that was slowly becoming fertile for change. Lambert entered the study carrying a tea service, his movements as graceful and practiced as they had been 5 years earlier. At 57, he looked younger than he had on their wedding day, the stress lines around his eyes replaced by an expression of contentment that spoke to the peace he had found in surrender. "The Morrison expansion is complete," he reported as he set down the tray. "The new fields are already showing promising growth, and the additional quarters for the workers are finished." "Excellent," Anabel replied, not looking up from her correspondence. "And the school?" "Martha has begun teaching the children their letters just as you instructed. Some of the neighboring planters have expressed concern about educating slaves, but none have dared to interfere directly." Anabel smiled at that. The neighboring planters had learned over the past 5 years that interfering with the Lambert plantation was a dangerous proposition. Too many of them owed her money or relied on her business connections, or simply feared what she might reveal about their own affairs if pressed. "Governor Smith sends his regards," Lambert continued, producing a letter from his pocket. "He's invited us to the Christmas reception at the governor's mansion." "How thoughtful of him," Anabel murmured, finally looking up from her papers. "I assume this invitation extends to both of us." "It does, though I suspect the other guests will find our presence educational." Lambert's use of the word educational made Anabel laugh, a rich, genuine sound that filled the study. Over the years, they had attended numerous social functions together, and each one had served as a demonstration of their unusual dynamic. Watching Lambert defer to his wife's judgment, seeing him seek her approval before speaking on important matters, observing the way he looked at her with undisguised admiration, it had a profound effect on other couples. Some were scandalized, others were intrigued, and a few, Anabel had noticed, began to experiment with their own power dynamics behind closed doors. "There's something else," Lambert said, his tone becoming more serious. "I received a visit from young Thomas Morrison this morning. He's heard about our arrangement, and he's asking for advice." Anabel set down her pen and gave Lambert her full attention. Thomas Morrison was the son of their former neighbor, a young man who had inherited a failing plantation and a wife who was reportedly far more intelligent than he was. "What kind of advice?" "He wants to know how to give his wife more authority without losing face in the community." This was not the first such inquiry they had received. Over the past 2 years, a small but growing number of couples had approached them seeking guidance on how to restructure their marriages along more practical lines. Anabel had developed a careful system for evaluating such requests, determining which couples were genuinely suited for such an arrangement and which were simply curious. "Bring him to dinner next week," she decided, "along with his wife. I want to observe them together before offering any counsel." "Of course." Lambert made a note in the small journal he carried for such purposes. "Shall I invite anyone else?" "The Whitfields, I think. Margaret Whitfield has been asking pointed questions about our household management, and I suspect she's ready to take a more active role in her own marriage." As Lambert left to send the invitations, Anabel returned to her correspondence. Among the letters was one that had arrived that morning from a woman in New Orleans, describing her own attempts to gain more control over her husband's business affairs. The woman wrote with a mixture of hope and desperation that Anabel recognized from her own past. She picked up her pen and began to write, "My dear Mrs. Beauregard, your letter moved me deeply, as it reminded me of my own struggles to find my place in a world that seemed determined to limit my possibilities. You ask for advice on how to convince your husband to allow you greater involvement in his business affairs. I would suggest that you begin not by asking for permission, but by demonstrating competence. Study his ledgers when he is away. Learn the names of his business associates and their particular interests. Understand the challenges he faces better than he understands them himself. Then, when the moment is right, offer solutions rather than requests. Remember that power is not something that can be given. It must be taken. But it must be taken with wisdom, patience, and absolute certainty in your own capabilities. I look forward to hearing of your progress. With sincere regards, Mrs. A. Lambert." As she sealed the letter, Anabel reflected on how far she had come from that frightened young woman who had once pressed shirts and arranged hair. The transformation had been complete, but it had also been carefully planned and executed. Every step had been calculated, every move designed to build upon the last. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel drew her attention to the window. A familiar coach was approaching, one that belonged to Mrs. Catherine Pemberton, the banker's wife who had fainted at Anabel's wedding 5 years earlier. Anabel smiled to herself. Mrs. Pemberton's visits had become more frequent over the past year, and their conversations had grown increasingly frank. The woman was clearly struggling with her own marriage to a man who treated her as little more than an ornament, and she had begun to ask pointed questions about how one might go about changing such a dynamic. Lambert appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Pemberton has arrived for her appointment. Show her to the morning room," Anabel instructed. "And Lambert, I'll be taking tea with her privately. Please ensure we're not disturbed." "Of course, Anabel." As Lambert left to greet their guest, Anabel gathered the letters she had been writing and locked them in her desk drawer. The network of women she had been cultivating was growing steadily, but it required careful management. Too much too fast would attract unwanted attention from those who had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Mrs. Pemberton was waiting in the morning room, her posture rigid with the kind of nervous energy that Anabel had learned to recognize in women who were contemplating fundamental changes to their lives. "Catherine," Anabel said warmly as she entered the room, "how lovely to see you again. You look well." "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice," Mrs. Pemberton replied, her voice carrying a tremor of anxiety. "I hope I'm not imposing." Not at all. Anabel settled into her chair with the fluid grace that had become her trademark. I assume this concerns the conversation we began last week about your husband's business practices. Catherine Pemberton nodded, her hands twisting in her lap. Anabel, I've been thinking about what you said, about demonstrating competence rather than asking for permission, but I'm not sure I have the courage to. Courage, Anabel interrupted gently, is not the absence of fear, Catherine. It's the decision to act despite the fear. Tell me, what have you discovered about your husband's affairs? Mrs. Pemberton's eyes widened slightly. How did you know I had been investigating? Because you're here, Anabel replied with a knowing smile. Women don't seek advice about changing their circumstances unless they've already begun to understand what those circumstances actually are. For the next hour, Catherine Pemberton revealed what she had learned about her husband's banking practices, the risky loans, the questionable investments, the growing debts that he had hidden from her. As she spoke, her voice grew stronger, more confident, and Anabel could see the transformation beginning. What you've described, and Anabel said when Catherine finished, is a man who is in over his head and too proud to admit it. The question is, are you prepared to save him from himself? I think so. But how? Anabel leaned forward, her dark eyes holding Catherine's gaze. The same way I saved Lambert, by taking control gradually, systematically, until he realizes that his best option is to surrender authority to someone more capable of wielding it. But the social implications will be whatever we make them, Anabel finished. Catherine, 5 years ago I was property. Today I own one of the most successful plantations in Virginia, and my husband defers to my judgment in all matters. If I can accomplish such a transformation, imagine what you might achieve starting from a position of legal equality. As Mrs. Pemberton left that afternoon, her step was noticeably lighter, her bearing more confident. Anabel watched from the window as the woman's carriage disappeared down the drive, knowing that she had just set another transformation in motion. The afternoon brought additional visitors, Margaret Whitfield seeking advice on managing her husband's political career, young Sarah Morrison asking for guidance on educating her children, and Mrs. Elizabeth Thornfield inquiring about investment opportunities that might be suitable for a woman of independent means. Each conversation was carefully calibrated, each piece of advice designed to encourage gradual change rather than dramatic confrontation. Anabel had learned that revolutions were most successful when they appeared to be evolutions, when the old order was replaced so gradually that resistance never had time to organize. As evening approached, Lambert appeared in the study doorway. "Your appointments are finished for the day," he reported. "Shall I prepare for dinner?" "Yes, but first come here," Anabel said, setting aside her papers. Lambert approached her desk and without being asked, he knelt beside her chair, a ritual that had become as natural as breathing for both of them. Anabel reached out and touched his face gently, studying the expression of contentment and devotion that had replaced the anxiety and failure she remembered from their early days together. "Are you happy, Lambert?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," he replied without hesitation. "You saved me, Anabel, not just from bankruptcy or social disgrace, but from myself. You showed me that there was strength in surrender, peace in submission, joy in serving someone worthy of service." Anabel smiled, remembering the broken man who had married her out of desperation 5 years earlier. "And you, my dear husband, showed me that power is most beautiful when it's freely given rather than forcibly taken." As Lambert rose to prepare for dinner, Anabel returned to her correspondence. Among the letters was one that had arrived that afternoon from a woman in Charleston, describing how she had successfully taken over her husband's shipping business after demonstrating her superior understanding of maritime trade routes. Another letter came from New Orleans, where a woman had used her knowledge of her husband's gambling debts to negotiate herself into a position of authority over their household finances. A third arrived from Savannah, where a plantation owner's wife had quietly assumed control of their agricultural operations and increased profits by 30%. The network was growing, spreading like ripples on a pond. Each success story inspired others, each transformation made the next one easier to accomplish. What had begun as one woman's desperate bid for survival was becoming a quiet revolution that was reshaping the very foundations of Southern society. That night, as Anabel prepared for bed, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From slave to master, from powerless to powerful, from victim to victor, the transformation had been complete, but it had also been just the beginning. In her desk drawer lay dozens of letters from women across the South who were discovering their own strength, their own capacity for leadership, their own ability to reshape the world around them. Some were wives seeking greater authority in their marriages. Others were widows learning to manage inherited properties. Still others were unmarried women who refused to accept the limitations society tried to impose upon them. All of them had heard the story of the audacious slave who married her master and made him kneel. All of them had seen proof that the impossible could become inevitable with enough courage, intelligence, and determination. Lambert entered their bedroom, moving with the quiet efficiency that had become his hallmark. He had long since stopped questioning his role in their relationship, had long since ceased to feel any shame about his submission to his wife's superior will. Instead, he had found in surrender a freedom that his former dominance had never provided. "The household is secured for the night," he reported, kneeling beside their bed as he did every evening. "Is there anything else you require?" Anabel looked down at him, this man who had once owned her and now belonged to her completely, and felt a surge of satisfaction that went beyond mere personal triumph. What they had created together was more than just a successful marriage or a profitable plantation. It was proof that human relationships could be based on honest acknowledgement of capability rather than arbitrary social conventions. "Tomorrow," she said, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, "we begin planning the next phase of our expansion. I want to establish a school for the education of women in household management and business affairs." Lambert's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "A revolutionary idea. Where do you plan to locate it?" "Here," Anabel replied, "on our own property. We'll start small, perhaps a dozen students, but I envision it growing into something significant, a place where women can learn not just domestic skills, but the arts of leadership, negotiation, and financial management." The neighboring planters will object strenuously. "Let them object," Anabel said with a smile that held more than a hint of steel. "By the time they realize what we're truly accomplishing, it will be too late to stop us." As Lambert rose and prepared for bed, Anabel stood at the window looking out over the plantation that had become the center of a quiet revolution. In the distance, she could see the lights of other great houses, other bastions of the old order that would soon face challenges they could not imagine. The audacious slave had become something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. She had become a teacher, a mentor, a symbol of what was possible when power was claimed by those truly capable of wielding it. And in the years to come, the women who learned from her example would carry that knowledge into every corner of Southern society, transforming marriages, businesses, and communities in ways that would reshape the very foundations of American life. The legend of Anabel Lambert would live on, not just as a story of personal triumph, but as proof that revolutions could be won not through violence or confrontation, but through the patient, systematic demonstration of superior capability. She had shown the world that the greatest power came not from force, but from the willing surrender of those who recognized true strength when they encountered it. And that lesson, once learned, would echo through generations, changing lives and reshaping society one relationship at a time. The first dominatrix in Virginia history had become something even more significant. She had become the architect of a new world, built on the foundation of honest acknowledgement of who was truly fit to lead. And as the Virginia night settled over the plantation, Anabel Lambert smiled to herself, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to expand her influence and reshape the world in her image. The revolution was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. If this story of power, transformation, and the courage to rewrite the rules of society moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Share this tale with others who need to hear that change is always possible, no matter how impossible it might seem. What did you think of Anabel's journey from slavery to mastery? Let us know in the comments below and tell us what other untold stories of courage and transformation you'd like to hear next. Remember, sometimes the greatest revolutions begin with a single person brave enough to say no more to the way things have always been. Until next time, keep questioning, keep growing, and keep believing in the power of human transformation.